This time on the RBI surplus transfers, which had come as a big help to the central government finances in the recent past. Recall that for the 9-month period of July 2020 to March 2021, the RBI had transferred nearly 1 lakh crore rupees to the cash-strapped centre. However, that level of transfer may be difficult this year, according to a report that highlights concerns that this year, let alone generating a surplus, the RBI may itself need a capital infusion from the government to maintain a minimum of 20.8% of its balance sheet as capital. For more on the story, we're joined by the author of the report, Professor Anant Narayan, who is an international banking and financial markets expert. Professor Narayan, great to have you with us. Your report talks about several scenarios and subsequent news commentary that leads us to ask a question that nobody normally would. And that question is the RBI broke?
Not at all, not at all. I think the RBI is extremely well capitalized. There is no question of the central bank being broke. In fact, we are sitting on record level of foreign currency reserves, over $640 billion. There are plenty of high quality assets on the books of the RBI. I think the point is the following. The point is that the Bimal Jalan committee recommendation was to hold a certain number, 20.8% of the overall balance sheet as economic capital for the RBI. Now, it gave a nice rationale around how much of risk the RBI could be holding on its books and therefore how much capital it needs to hold. But I think the larger intent was to ensure that the government doesn't start dipping into what looks like the capital of the RBI to effectively monetize its deficit. And this is a point which I think people should understand. While it seems like the RBI and the government are two different entities, and they are independent entities, from an actual perspective, they're both the sovereign nation. They both belong to the same entity, right? To that extent, now, as of March 31st, 2021, there was about 12 lakh crores of capital on the books of RBI. Far from being broke, it had 12 lakh crores of economic capital on the books. Now, does that mean like an ONGC or like a BPCL or a PSU or a State Bank of India, could it pay a higher dividend to the government? This is not like any other PSU. This is a sovereign monetary authority. So even if you found a great justification for transferring some money as dividend, effectively what you're doing between left pocket and right pocket of the sovereign is printing money. So while you might find a good justification, any special dividend given by the central bank is effectively printing money. Now, printing money has implications. On one hand, it could be good. You could stoke good demand. Maybe that sets off a good virtuous cycle of bringing in supply, bringing in employment, and all of those nice things. It could also stoke inflation. And more often than not, unfortunately, we've seen printing of money stoke inflation. Also, if you tell the government there is 12 lakh crores which can be dipped into, can you imagine what anyway the government is short of funds, the temptation to dip into that pot and try and monetize more and more will be quite large, with very severe implications for things like inflation. So to avoid those kind of controversies, I think the wise men behind that particular committee said, let's keep a cap on how much the government can extract from the RBI, and they put this magical number of 20.8%. I think if the RBI and the government can explain to the public at large and all stakeholders that the intent is not to monetize and to create inflation, that there will be good control using the MPC and other institutions to ensure that inflation is kept under control, then revisiting this line in the sand of 20.8%, I think can be justified. And I think ought to be the way forward, rather than trying to manage the size of the balance sheet by using some market instruments which are purely meant to manage the size of the balance sheet as opposed to achieving public good.
Now, given all of this, how long can the recent trend of the RBI transferring large amounts of capital every year to the central government continue?
There are two streams of income that the RBI actually gets, okay? Because the RBI holds foreign currency assets and because it holds government bonds, it earns interest on them. And by the way, how does it fund these assets? It funds these assets by taking in money from banks. Banks place their cash reserve ratios with the RBI. Also, we fund the RBI. Every currency note in our pocket is actually a source of funds for the Reserve Bank of India. So actually the Reserve Bank earns money through this interest income on its assets, which is funded by practically interest-free liabilities in the form of bank deposits and currency in circulation. This income is called seigniorage income, okay? And it's absolutely legitimate income for every central bank and therefore every government in the world. That monetization or that dividend transfer will happen on an ongoing basis. The part which is queasy and which is where the questions arise, there is a second income which is possible for central banks. Remember, they're holding lots of foreign currency assets. If the RBI had bought dollars at 60, that is $1 is 60 rupees, and the dollar value goes up to 70, 73 right now, 73 and a half, then notionally, the RBI has earned 13 rupees on every dollar it has purchased. But that's a notional income, it's not a realized income. Now, if you started to realize some of those asset revaluation by effectively revaluing your assets and taking it as part of P&L, that's where it becomes a little queasy. In last year, the reason why they came to almost 1 lakh crores of dividend was because they did this. They converted a part of this revaluation reserves into booked earnings using some accounting entries. Frankly, that part of income is not very, in my view at least, is not completely legitimate. I would much rather that they restricted themselves to seigniorage income. That number will be there, 60, 70,000 crores, which will keep growing over the years, will absolutely be there. That's legitimate. Transferring some of this revaluation of assets into profit and loss and converting it into dividend, that part, I hope the RBI doesn't use too much of that.
Professor Narayan, thanks so much for joining us. A very insightful report, and thanks for taking out the time.